Today I'm speaking with Andrew Jasko. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's great to be here.
And for anyone that doesn't know Andrew is the founder of a group called Life After Dogma. He's also an author, and I'll have the links for his work there with Life After Dogma under the video if you want to check that out after we're done. But just to give a bigger bio, he lives in California, and he studied theology and Bible at Wheaton College and earned a Master of Divinity at Princeton Theological Seminary. A lot of us are very familiar with that one. You were born into a minister's family, and you became an Assemblies of God preacher and a missionary even to India, which is that's pretty cool, pretty extreme. I'd love to dig into that in a second. You are working on your second master's degree, is that correct?
That's right.
In counseling psychology, focused on marriage and family therapy currently as a trainee at Golden Gate University. And just in terms of an overall theme, I've seen that you want to help heal religious and spiritual trauma and find healthy, authentic spirituality that suits the people that you're working with. In terms of something we're going to dive into in a few minutes, you're also what's called a non-dual humanist, which I'm looking forward to seeing what that means. But besides just the bio I gave so far, can you tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you like to do with your life when you're not doing all that other work?
Absolutely. So that's my work, is helping people heal from religious trauma and spiritual abuse, and really exposing that, breaking it down in writing, helping therapists understand, helping ministers understand what that is and what that means and how it impacts people. And so besides that, I'm a big nerd, psychology and spirituality nerd, and just out here in California enjoying the nature. I'm definitely into what people categorize as mysticism, things like meditation, psychedelic work, and yoga, other contemplative practices that induce other states of consciousness and other ways of being human. So, and I have a religious trauma coaching program that's targeted to all the major areas of religious indoctrination and healing that people go through.
I'm just curious, are you working more with individuals or groups, or is it kind of mixed, all the above?
Right now, individuals, but I'm starting a video home study course. So that'll be coming out soon. And then I'll be doing group work with that as well. And we also have a Facebook support group.
That's awesome. I do like to throw before we get into some of the meat of the interview, just a quick icebreaker. And so I thought, since you're there in California, I would just ask, since I don't know too much about California, if you were going on vacation and assume a non-COVID timeframe, what's some of your favorite places to go on vacation there in California?
I'm going to say Mount Shasta.
Okay.
It's just this amazing, spectacular mountain, and there's waterfalls and just the camping and the forest. It's amazing. It's got everything you could want there. I was just there, saw 2 bears. That was fun.
Well, were they far away, or did they come anywhere near you?
Close. One was just driving past my car. I just looked in the forest and it was like, what was that? And okay, that's a bear.
Yeah, glad you didn't jump out in front of your car or something. That's crazy. Well, I've never been to California, but I do sometimes see this meme that comes through where it says something like, "Oh, you're from California," and it has a picture of like the city with 6 lanes, on each road, and a bunch of cars backed up, and it says, "No, I'm from California," and the picture is like mountains and beautiful trees. So it sounds like Mount Shasta is kind of that secondary picture of not the big city, but the beautiful nature part of California.
Yeah,
that's awesome. So what I like to do is often just ask people just to introduce kind of their background. Tell us what your background was like. I know that you, from what I do know of you, and I don't know your full story, but I've watched a couple of your videos, and I've gotten the sense that you grew up in a very Christian and spiritual background, got heavily influenced on it, but some things kind of became negative, and you took it a couple different. There were a couple different points to your journey. You ended up in a bit of a different spot than me, which I'd love to dive into too, kind of where you're at with things now. But where did your journey start from with Christianity?
Started before I was born, when the Holy Spirit spoke to my father to go out in New Jersey and start a church, to train up missionaries and evangelists to save the world for Jesus. So my mother had a prophecy about me that I was going to become this great man of God before I was born. and they took me straight from the hospital to the church altar to devote me to a life of service to God. So I'm still doing that, but kind of in a reverse way,
Yeah. Was that, there were Assemblies of God too?
Yeah, like the
Okay.
whole Antichrist thing, but it actually serves the kingdom of God in a backwards way anyway. So,
Since you mentioned, I'm just curious, did they ever, has that ever come up as like what happened to that prophecy kind of thing? Or is it kind of a topic that doesn't come up too much now?
it hasn't come up, no, but I'm curious. I mean, I know that there are people there who are praying for me, and I'm sure they're expecting this glorious testimony. I went out and partied and did psychedelics and went to Burning Man and did all this evil antichrist work, and now I have this great testimony of coming back to the faith, because that's what they need to believe in order to deal with their overwhelming anxiety that their son is going to burn in hell forever, right? It's a terrible thing to live with.
So that's a good point to point out. Your religious background definitely included an eternal conscious torment, not just a annihilation or anything like that.
That's right. And I think that the most foundational motivation behind evangelical Christianity is hell. The driving force behind the whole thing is this traumatic fear. And that's what motivates most of people's behavior, their devotion to the faith, their evangelism, the way they live their lives. It's that bedrock fear, the worst fear imaginable. Hell is the ultimate horrible thing you can think of, evil to the nth degree.
Yeah. And then you add to it as Pine Creek says, do you know Pine Creek, by the way?
No.
He's a YouTuber that he just critiques. He's an atheist YouTuber who critiques people, but he calls it carrots and sticks. The carrot of heaven and the stick of hell, and that just keeps you going.
And
Good.
It's really ironic, isn't it? Because if hell exists, then God is Satan.
Yeah, basically. Yeah, and if he knew that would all end up that way, where the majority of humanity would end up in hell, then why couldn't he have chosen to just not create it in the first place, or never create Satan, or never let him get into Eden, blah, 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 all these things he could have done and chose not to do.
It's just the ultimate evil plan. It's Dr. Evil is God. I mean, the really the most diabolical thing you can imagine is that the creator of the universe, his master plan, the best thing you can imagine is that 95% of humanity is suffering in an eternal concentration torture camp forever, maximum torture, no remediation, and that at the end times he comes and he slaughters most of humanity, invades the planet with weapons of mass destruction, and destroys nature and destroys everybody and sets up an ironclad rule. It's really interesting stuff. You got to wonder who's behind this.
Yeah.
Maybe those dark spiritual forces do exist.
Yeah. Now, going back to your childhood, I'm assuming that as a child, this was not something you approached with disbelief or sarcasm, that at that point you believed it as well as a young man?
So I remember when I was 5 years old, laying in bed at night, praying the sinner's prayer over and over again, and terrified that I was going to fall asleep without confessing some sin, because if I let go of my consciousness, I might wake up in hell. And I developed a phobia of sleep. And this is a common thing, by the way, for people with religious trauma. And I was just so horrified of hell. I mean, I would pray the sinner's prayer and confess my sin obsessively, compulsively, thousands of times a day for years. I mean, they would show us these plays, Heaven's Gates, Hell's Flames. I'm not sure if you've seen that.
Is that kind of like a Left Behind concept?
It's this drama that they teach churches to perform, where they show people right before they're going to die, and then they die and they had a choice to accept or reject Jesus. And then it shows them burning in hell and being tortured, or in heaven. So they would constantly reinforce this message of hell. They have altar calls. They had them in my church every single service. You never know what's going to happen to you. You could die at any moment. So as a child, you're receiving these messages, and there's nothing more psychologically traumatizing or abusive than this reinforcement, this message that you need to obey, or else you will be burnt with fire, psychological and physical, forever. That's an extreme form of abuse, and that gave me an anxiety disorder. I had so much anxiety, and I had no idea why.
Did it come out in any other ways besides the sleep that you recollect?
I mean, very obsessive thinking
Huh.
and obsessive compulsive rituals like confession, like Bible reading, like going to church, like evangelism. So this kind of a fear and trauma drives religious devotion.
Mm.
And they capitalize on it in every way possible. So it definitely resulted. I mean, my ego was being formed around these kind of ideologies. So
That's a good way to put it.
I've had to, it's taken years to unwind that and to ground myself in my body. I mean, I think I really would dissociate, just go into my mind or go out of my mind because of some of these fears or be stuck in my mind. So there's a lot there. But
Mm.
anyway, that was just one thing about my childhood. So I grew up in this very devoted, very extreme missionary church, focused on saving the lost and evangelism. I would go to church like every other day. I was always a part of church
Wow.
and just very, very devoted, very serious about every aspect of Christianity. Never questioned it because it was my reality. This was the reality that we were raised in.
Yeah.
And anything that doesn't fit within that worldview, you have to make sense of that. You don't make sense of your worldview as the Bible. This is the way it is,
Yeah.
right? So I grew up in that, and when I was a part of the youth group, which is its own traumatic thing because we're taught basically it's like a boot camp for resisting and hating and suppressing your sexuality. The
Yeah.
youth group. It's this countercultural thing, and it's really isolating because it teaches you need to isolate from your peer group. And this is a stage in life where teenagers are developing their sense of belonging and identity and learning how to relate to other people socially. And then they're taught you can't have these friends except to evangelize them, and you need to be careful or they might tempt you into sin and you'll go to hell. So I isolated and I had to deal with just being socially awkward and not really fitting in school and just being with the youth group where I was being given all these very fearful, very anti-human kinds of messages.
Mm.
But I didn't realize any of that until later. So I went to Wheaton College, studied Bible and theology, had my first missionary trip to India, and decided I was going to be a missionary for life to India to convert Hindus and Muslims to Jesus and to raise up indigenous leaders to convert all of their unreached people groups, all of the ethno-linguistic tribal groups that had not yet received the gospel.
Could I ask, just to step back a teeny bit? You mentioned the gospel, a couple times with the pastors giving an altar call, presenting the gospel. Being hopeful at that point to have been a missionary to share the gospel with other people. A lot of people that we might share this with would know exactly what we mean by the gospel. Some people might not know or might have a different definition. Just from what your background is, could you give a simple, not in a Christian preaching sense, obviously, but just what is the gospel? What does that mean?
The gospel is a message, it's supposed to be good news on how to be saved from hell. It does boil down to hell again, but it's that you are to believe in the doctrine, the message given, mediated through your church, mediated through the religious authorities about what the Bible means. And this message is that you are a sinner, you are evil, you are depraved. And because of that, you're under God's judgment and wrath, and you deserve hell and judgment and wrath. And so you need to be saved. You can't do anything to save yourself. So Jesus died for your sins, and his murder on the cross is supposed to somehow pay the price for your sins. And if you believe in this message and accept him and submit your life to this system of belief, then you will belong to the community of faith and you will go to heaven when you die.
That's perfect. That was exactly what I was hoping to hear from you. That we are, some people I've heard the gospel means a little bit different, in the sense of you want to live a good life before God, obey the commandments or whatever. That was a very similar message to what I heard. It's it's very much starts with what you said. It's kind of the let me give you the bad news. Let me give you the good news. You stand condemned. You're in Adam. You're judicially condemned before you even sin yourself. You kind of get doubly condemned by actually actively sinning. And certainly the world, the flesh, and the devil just make that impossible to resist. So you're born a sinner. You become an active sinner by your own choice. You're condemned across the board, and pretty much you have no hope apart from Christ. And pretty much it's not even that you can do it. This is the Calvinism in me coming out, but you're not just dying in your sins. You're dead. You're not drowning in the water. You're the corpse at the bottom of the ocean. You can't reach up to Christ, to God. God has to reach down and give you the ability to even receive his message, to receive his spirit. And then as he gives you that power, you accept, like you said, the free gift of Jesus being murdered, of dying in your place. And when you identify with his death and resurrection, you become a child of God. You become judicially given his righteousness as opposed to your own sinfulness. And when you're standing there in Christ, identifying with his death and resurrection, you become sealed. You become the inheritor of this eternal salvation that's positionally in place today and experientially going to happen when you die, or if you believe in the rapture, when you get raptured. It's funny though. It sounds to some people like such good news. I remember I've heard people, I've described it before as abusiveness, especially to children. And the sarcastic response from Christians is, oh yeah, I'm so traumatized by knowing that God loves me so much. How do you deal with it when people respond with that kind of sense of like, what do you mean this is a bad thing? Like God dealt with your sin. God could have just left you to be dead and to be deserving punishment and to eventually get eternal punishment. God pulled you out. What part of this is so negative? I'm sure you get some of that feedback, and I'm probably kind of summarizing different kinds of feedback you get. But when you get that kind of feedback, what do you typically say if you feel like if they're actually open to your response?
Yeah, and if people are really in fundamentalism, I don't really find that a logical argument tends to get anywhere. For me, it's really if they're starting to see cracks in the system or starting to question certain things or are experiencing their own problems with it, their own psychological issues with it. So the thing is that they have their own system of illogic for explaining anything that I tell them. This whole field called apologetics devoted to giving some sort of answer that works for them. It's not fully logical, but you're able to accept that. So I don't really, but if I wanted to break it down with them, I mean, why are you evil? Why are you bad? So the whole premise to begin with, I mean, so you're saying that human beings are fundamentally evil and wicked? And like, what's wrong with that? I mean, what mother tells her child and thinks about her child when it's born, look at this wicked, wretched thing. I mean, it's so evil. Someone needs to change it, right? Instinctually, we know that every child is a beautiful, precious, every human being is precious and unique and spectacular. And there's an inherent beauty and goodness. Not to say that, we have the potentiality for the full spectrum of human behavior within ourselves, right?
Yeah.
But still, we know instinctively, I think pretty much everyone, that there's a beauty and a uniqueness and a goodness that needs to be cultivated and encouraged. So in any other system of thought or context other than religion, we wash over this just because it's sanctified under the guise of religion. But anyone, even who is religious, calls these things emotional and verbal abuse when it takes place in a school, when it takes place in the workplace. So if you start just telling someone, you know what, you're evil, did you know this? And explaining to them and unpacking how screwed up they are, how they can't trust in their thinking, they're totally depraved, they can't trust their intuition, they can't trust their heart. And what you need to do is buy into my multi-level marketing scheme. And I know how to turn your life around. That's abuse. It's very clearly psychologically manipulation and abuse, but because we've been indoctrinated and enculturated in it, people don't recognize it as such. So really what this is it's predatory. Evangelism is predatory. And one of the first tenets of evangelism is to show people that they are depraved, to show people that they have a need for the gospel, to convince them that there's something wrong.
Yeah.
So part of the reason why the gospel is so appealing to people, like you said, is because of suffering, because we all experience a sense of powerlessness and we all have our own traumas. So really, Christianity tends to take root in areas of poverty. And when people are really suffering with something, and then the missionaries or the people come in and they say, we have this empowering message, this is the solution to your trauma. And people are like, yeah, you know what? I am broken. I'm so messed up. There's a lot going on in my life. I resonate with that I'm powerless. I feel powerless. I'm doing all these bad behaviors that I don't like. I'm a bad person.
Yeah.
And God loves me. God will rescue me. And this community won't judge me. They'll rescue me. So that's very appealing, but it's very, very abusive and toxic. And it's the opposite of healing, the very opposite. What people need in order to heal is unconditional love and acceptance. And so to be taught, even though you are dealing with, say, this drug addiction, right? It's not your fault. It's not because you're a bad person. These things happen to you. You experience these traumas. And through cultivating an empathic, non-judgmental awareness through your own practice or with a therapist, that's when the healing starts to happen, is when we start to trust in our own faculties, when we start to harness our own empowerment. So healing is literally the exact opposite process.
I love how you articulated that. That was just spot on in so many ways, and a lot of little nuances there I could ask about. But I love the fact that you're cutting through the niceties of it. You're cutting through the ways that it gets dressed up. It is abuse, and the abusiveness is, as you said, it would be obvious in a different context. And it's ironic to me that there's even Christians that that I know, and I've seen people talk about, like, oh, if people are in a marriage, even a Christian marriage, and someone's being abusive, that the Christians need to rally around that person that's being abused and help them. Or if you're considering marrying someone that's abusive, everyone would rally and say, don't do it. Don't marry an abusive person. And they would identify the abuse fairly quickly, fairly obviously, you would think, and they protect people left and right. And yet, when you really look at this psychopathic character, the Yahweh character of the Bible, it's like somehow there's such a disconnect. And you mentioned the word brainwashing. I know you've talked before about this identity theft, where this is really, it's taking away the real you, and it's taking away your ability to be yourself, to see yourself correctly, and in a sense to see the world correctly. But it kind of, it sets it up with, and comes out in a couple ways with Christian apologetics, but this whole idea of, it really doesn't matter what we are like and how we interpret the world here in our world. At the end of the day, God is so other. He's holy. He's the king. He can do what he wants. So, for example, with the story of Noah, God could say, I see that there's some bad people on the planet. And I know that Noah's not real. It's a copy of a story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. But just for sake of example, if it had been real, God could look at the bad people of the world and say, you're a thief, you're a murderer, I'm going to kill you. But it's kind of like, and this is someone else's example, not mine, but like if someone had attacked, a man had attacked a bunch of girls, and he's brought into court, and the judge says, I condemn you to death for what you did to the bad guy, and everyone's applauding. Yeah, he gets his justice for what he did. He attacked these people, and then the judge turns to the girls who got attacked, and he says, oh, by the way, you die too. Everyone's jaws would drop. What do you mean the girls that are the victims would die too? They didn't do anything. But yet the Noah story, it's like complete blinders. It's like, that's exactly what's happening. He's just wiping out babies and nice old grandmas. He's killing everybody, and he's psychopathic, but we're like, he's God, he's the king. And it's really amazing to me how much, like, once you cross that line in your mind, especially as a kid, once that's your baseline, that this God character is completely beyond question. And that's what it's about. You cannot question him. All kinds of things are excusable that you'd never excuse in your own personal life. And I think that's a big part of what you're talking about with the psychology of this, that like you cannot, some people are just, they haven't seen enough cracks. And that's, to me, was one of the biggest ones. I don't know if that was where you started. I do want to go back to some of the early cracks you had, but that was one of the cracks. I was like, this just doesn't, he's a psychopath. What do you mean he's so jealous? He's going to kill you. You ask for bread and water, but he sends you snakes to die. Like, come on.
Exactly. But you can't see it when it's a part of your identity, because your sense of meaning and belonging and acceptance and safety is all tied up in the doctrine and the community. So that's a way more fundamental need than the cognitive and the intellectual and the making sense, right? That's the survival based kind of stuff. So we work that way. And so I think it's generally that those issues tend to be shaken, and then the intellectual or in conjunction as well. But there were several things that you touched on here as well. So in that ideology, one of the big issues I see with it is that God is separate. I think that as a mystic, to me, that's like the biggest crack right there. Because if you say that this being of ultimate love is separate from you, then your humanity is degraded. You're not good. You're not loving. Everything you get has to come from an outside source, an outside power. So it's this whole thing of outsourcing your power through belief, through obedience, and having to receive. It's this fundamentally victim, disempowered position, because I'm not inherently good. I need to have a merger with this deity vis-a-vis the church and the scriptures and the practices in order to have any goodness. I don't have inherent goodness. And so for someone like me who's a non-dualist and a humanist, I mean, I would say, if you want to use God as a metaphor, right? God is nature outside of me. That's the creator and the creation. And I'm a part of that. I am nature. As so, God is me, fully me and fully that, as a metaphor, right? Or some people take that literally. So I think when you make that step, though, then love is separate from you. Goodness is separate from you. And then there's this whole outsourcing, abuser-victim type relationship. And then another thing, God isn't mysterious in this framework of belief. So even if we believe in a God, this God should be way beyond our understanding, just way beyond just a simple little archaic book that one tribe happens to get and only reveals God's self to this little group of people. But because of the doctrine of inerrancy, which I think is the foundation that this whole thing is based around, and where a ton of the trauma comes around with religious fundamentalism and with biblical fundamentalism, is because they believe that this book has no flaws. It contains the perfect revelation of God. You have to obey everything in it. So you have to swallow the whole camel and strain out the gnats and swallow the camel, right? Like Jesus said, and neglect the weightier matters of the law, like love and justice, because you have to accept the genocide and the love, the good and the bad. You can't scrutinize it. It's all God. And that's not mysterious. If God is so mysterious, God should not be confined to this little book and totally defined by it and subject to its obvious and blatant errors. But you can't question it. You have to do all of it.
Do you remember what was kind of were so many different like topics and subtopics that were kind of working around? Do you remember which one would have been like the earliest one for you that kind of said, I need to think about this, or this feels wrong, or like what would you say was the very first thought that didn't end up with, praise God, this is awesome to learn more about him, or praise him, like where you just said, something's wrong here?
So I was always someone who struggled, and I thought
with theology,
psychologically,
okay,
and with obeying the Bible. And I didn't really want to do devotions. It didn't really appeal to me, but I just did it because I was told I needed to. So I sought all of my solutions from the system, because you're taught that if there's something wrong, it can't be something wrong with the religion. It has to be something wrong with you. So I used all their ready-made solutions. I got Christian therapy, so therapy through the Bible and not through actual psychology, or through a very constrained and limited view of that. And deliverance ministry, being taught that there were demonic attachments to my suffering, or just my own human frailty and inability and weakness. So really, when I was in seminary getting my Master of Divinity, this is when it came to a breaking point for me, because I was just so sick of all the anxiety and fear that I was experiencing, and I didn't know what was going on. And I think sexuality was a huge thing to me too. I always viewed my sexuality as a curse from God, and I prayed that God would take it away, because it was so much more trouble than it's worth to try to be constantly fighting your humanity to these urges and this really dangerous part of you that can throw you into hell. Your sexual thoughts and desires and dreams and masturbation.
Could we explore that a little bit? Like what was the expectation of what was, before you talk about the struggle, like what was it expected that you would be like and think like what was the baseline of godliness for that area?
So the baseline is thought purity, thought and emotional purity. So in this version of fundamentalism, every thought and emotion has to be in submission to the will of the deity. So it's not just your behaviors, it's your thoughts and desires. And for sexuality, this is any unsanctioned sexual anything. And the only thing that was sanctioned was between you and your wife. That's it. A heterosexual monogamous couple.
And not just in reality, but even in your fantasy world.
Even in your fantasy, right. I mean, they said that it's okay to kind of have the thought, but not allow the chickens to roost, right? So it's like, oh, it's there, but you don't engage in it.
Did you hear the look once but don't look twice thing?
Right. So, but I mean, honestly, 90+% of our sex lives have nothing to do with our spouse. If you just tabulate like throughout your whole lifespan, all of your sexuality and all of your thoughts and fantasies and everything, it's just not human. It doesn't work for humans. And especially when we're getting married much later in life and we have active sex drives, this is torture for developing adolescents. I mean, it's so cruel and so developmentally harmful. And it's one of the biggest issues I work with people in coaching and in recovery. Because when you've repressed and shamed and hated your sexuality for almost your whole life, and then you come out of that, there's a lot of baggage, there's a lot of shame and guilt, often sexual dysfunction, performance anxiety, because you've never really experienced this, and you're with partners now who have been in their sexuality for years. So there's a ton of trauma. Then there's the LGBTQIA plus community, and that's a world in and of itself. So this was a big issue for me, and it never fully sat right with me, just how sex could be such a horrible thing in my experience, and how God would inflict me with this terrible torture.
Could I ask, was that, you mentioned, that in the midst of the context of a marriage, that it was appropriate in that sense. Was there a sense of that anyone gave of like, look, if you do it God's way, if you just stay pure in reality and in your mind, get married when God opens that door, earlier or later, then it's God's plan, it's the best, and it's not a negative. It's at that point you're supposed to celebrate. Like, I guess two questions really for you personally. Did you see, like, were they trying to put you into this funnel where you kind of just suppress it all, but at the end, once you get through into marriage, it kind of all turns beautiful? And then is it kind of a corollary? Do you find people who, whether that was how you would describe it for yourself or not, just where people try really hard to kind of flip that switch of like, for just to be specific, a guy being told, don't look at a girl's curves, certainly don't look, at anything beyond that. Certainly don't be erotic in any sense. Just, eroticism is just not on the table in any way, certainly for a young man or a young woman who wants to be pure. And then the implication of, like, what you're preached at and the Song of Solomon is that the minute that you're married, that whole hinge flips, and you're now like, go for it, gangbusters. If you're in what I was exposed to as a biblically based sense of sexuality, it's for procreation, but it's also for pleasure. God obviously loves, we're designed to enjoy him forever, as we're told in the catechism, and we're designed to enjoy him through the creation that he gave us. And yet, from what I've seen, a lot of people can't, like, that hinge doesn't actually flip. If you have this message of don't, you try to say all of a sudden do, and do with all your might and enjoy it, it doesn't work out that way. Do you see people feeling like that at all? Or
I think that's the norm for people who are in recovery from religious indoctrination. Almost everyone. I haven't met someone who hasn't had those issues, because you've been sexually, psychologically abused. You've been taught to associate your sexual thoughts and desires with being tortured in hell. That level of an association is actually there on just behaviorism level, like Pavlov's dog, kind of a thing. So that's severe, and the level of shame, and that you should repress it. So we're trained in sexual repression. Repress every thought, repress every desire, resist it, confess it, go to an accountability group, all of these things, so that you've really been programmed at a deep psychological level. And yeah, I think for most people it takes some work, and a big thing is to have patience with yourself. Like, don't beat yourself up, don't be too hard on yourself, and that hopefully you can find a partner who will understand and have compassion, and you can explore things slowly, just explore feeling each other's bodies and not letting it unfold naturally. And if there's some dysfunction, working with the anxiety around that, not making it about a performance. So there's a lot to be worked through here. And but especially working through what you've been through and how you relate to your own sexuality, I think those things have to be unpacked and worked through.
Do you find, for the guys especially, that the idea that God can see your thoughts, that God's basically always watching, that there's always a security camera even in your head, that is it all part of it? I can't imagine that. I'm kind of implying it must be, but I'm sure maybe I'm sure in some of the questions that I ask people that I'm reading into it my experience, and I'm sure some people would say no, it wasn't really part of it. But I get the sense that just this all-seeing eye, God's watching you. Exactly. There is no dark corner where his security camera can't see. That's got to be hard to flip off for some people. Like, it just feels like even if you were secretly wanting to be erotic or enjoy your wife, in a good sense, it's like you've been thinking so long that someone's watching me and judging me. How is he suddenly still watching me? He's still there in the room watching me do this act, and yet suddenly it's all okay. The security camera analogy, I don't know if it really is, it captures what I'm saying, but I think you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah. The all-seeing eye of Sauron. And that's in the Bible. I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to render everyone according to what their deeds deserve. So to punish them. It's this Google search engine of God. God's really a voyeur, isn't he?
Yeah.
He just wants to, really obsessed with my sex life. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as a side note, this is what we just talked about with God seeing. It reminds me of Hitchens, but Hitchens also talked about, just as a side note to sexuality, the idea of circumcision, genital mutilation. Like, this goes back to some of what you said at the beginning about, children being innocent and not sinners, but like, who in their right mind, and I say that tongue in cheek because I know a lot of people do this, but like, who would say this beautiful baby is here? And I'm kind of semi-quoting Hitchens here, summarizing him, but who would say this baby is so beautiful, perfect in every way, now hand me the scalpel so I can do the work of the Lord? Like, what? Come on.
But you know what? We were taught to spiritually and psychologically castrate ourselves and circumcise ourselves. So circumcision is actually a metaphor in the Bible of,
that's right,
kind of cutting yourself off and giving yourself fully to God. So there is some really dark stuff in that book and in this system. I mean, if there's something that's demonic, this is it. I see fundamentalism as psychological spirit possession. It's the enslavement of human spirituality, the enslavement of consciousness, and the opposite of spirituality in a lot of ways. For me, spirituality is about human flourishing, self-actualization, finding your connection to humanity, to nature, finding how your meaning and purpose fits within you, fits within that system. And so it's about that connection, that sense of meaning and purpose, and sovereignty, standing in your own power and sovereignty, creating in the world out of who you are. So what does this religious ideology do? It comes in and steals that sovereignty and says, you must bow before this deity who will torment you with images of fire, who will invade your consciousness, who will constantly terrorize you and scrutinize every thought. I mean, isn't that what demons do?
Yeah. It is. But I was going to ask too. I want to get back in a quick second to your story because I want to keep that going. But just since we're talking about sexuality and people working through this, do you find that it, like, what is the percentage of people who are coming to you saying, I want to still believe in my precious Jesus. He's the love of my life. I've just had some really bad pastors and teachers, some bad, Bible study groups, what have you, books that misled me. But I want to get back to the pure love of God, of Yahweh, of Jesus. This book is his love letter to me. I just want to heal my my sexuality, my self-image, and versus people that say, I recognize that I cannot be healed from my self-image, my sexuality issues without cutting this stuff out of my life. Like, are people trying to keep, in your experience, are they trying to keep God and Jesus, and I'm sure you deal with other religions too, but are they trying to keep their deity in the picture, or are they trying to take it out, or is it just a whole big mixture of stories?
There's a lot of different approaches that people take, and so I really try my best not to be dogmatic about this,
Yeah.
because I recognize that I've changed my perspective too. And I think one of the traps we can get caught in is identifying our egos and identifying ourselves with our beliefs, even if that's atheism or spirituality or whatever it is, and getting into this superiority complex. These people are delusional and I'm superior, yeah, I'm enlightened. And it's just, to me, like, I want to be able to relate to people on that human level, and ideology is one aspect, but it's not who I am. My ideology isn't me, So people are usually in a stage of transition, often after they've already left, but a lot of people do want to have some kind of belief in God, but they're in that abusive relationship with God, this God who loves them but also abuses them.
Yeah.
So I work with them wherever they're at. Really, it's about their process. But often people are in a process of transitioning and deconverting, and it takes time, and that basically unravels at its own pace.
Yeah.
But people
awesome.
people do end up choosing some more progressive version of Christianity or whatever religion they're in, or they'll end up being atheist or some non-religious type of spirituality. I'm really about harm reduction and empowerment. I want people to do what's authentic for them, not what's dictated to them.
Yeah. And I think too, just in our culture, it's practically, for some people, it's really hard to leave. And even if they were, theoretically had to check a box, they might say, yeah, I guess I don't believe. If you, for example, were to say, do you really believe in the virgin birth, the resurrection, that Jesus' blood literally is what cleanses you from your sin? Do you believe he's up in heaven? He's going to return someday, blah, blah, blah. They might say, I think it might be real, but it might also be mythology. It might be metaphor, it might be parable, blah, blah, blah. But like, practically, to tell anybody, whether it's your job or your family or friends, hey, I'm not really a Christian anymore, that's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow. And it has huge community ramifications, and it's not a pill everyone can swallow, to be honest. And so to be able to say, of course I'm a Christian, I follow Christ, but what they mean by that is just I follow the better parts of the beatitudes or whatever. I want to be a peacemaker. I want to love my neighbor. I don't want to cast the first stone, blah, blah, blah. And that's they're Christian. And it kind of keeps them in the conversation with other people. And I have learned a little bit more to respect that. It's been a hard thing for me to see some people who kind of, they admit behind the scenes, they know it's mythology. They know it's not real. But progressive Christianity finds a middle ground that they're comfortable with. And I've had to, kind of bite my tongue at times and just be like, I need to learn that there's a balance, and not everyone's going to land the same place. They're going to maybe find some common ground with me or with someone else, but they're not going to land the same place as I do. They're not going to, I'm more in line of Richard Dawkins. I'm in more of a militant atheist perspective. A lot of people are going to want a much, much softer tone with that stuff. And it's, I'm learning from different people, even people I interview, to figure out how to play all the sides, not play, but just how to keep the conversations going, and yet still be willing to put some of the things out there that I'm studying about the origins of Christianity. But could I, if you want to respond to that, and then could you take us back to your story, because I don't want to get too off track. Where you went from there.
I'll take it back to that, and we'll weave this back in. So when I was in seminary, I was really dealing with a lot of anxiety and struggles with my sexual repression. And I just got really desperate, and I made a commitment to myself. I just said, I'm going to do whatever it takes to rid myself of this fear. And after I made that commitment, I feel like it was almost like a Saul of Tarsus experience. Like the scales started to fall from my eyes, and I just began to see that so much of my anxiety and trauma was rooted in the Bible and was rooted in the teachings I received about the Bible. So that began this rude awakening process where it all started unraveling really quickly for me. And so
can I throw in, did you have people you could talk to about it, or were you kind of a loner and all that?
I mean, I was a loner for a lot of it. I got support with Marlene Winnell and her organization, so that was really, really great. And but as far as my immediate community, I did have one other friend who was already an atheist who I spoke with. But I was a ministry intern, and then a minister after that. After I graduated, I went and took a ministry job in New York City because I wasn't ready to give up my career. I had no other way of income, but I had already given up my dream to become a missionary to India. I'd been there on 5 shorter term trips. I was planning on moving there permanently after, so that wasn't going to work anymore for obvious reasons. And right after I graduated seminary, I ended up going to Burning Man. This big festival, drugs and sex and everything in the desert. Really, really good, really great experience. I recommend it. And
it's
then
like a modern Woodstock sort of, right?
Kind of, yeah, it is. But it has a lot of philosophy embedded in the culture about really finding yourself and self-actualization and embracing your sexuality, exploring and breaking out of the box of what you were programmed to be, whether that's from your career, secular or religious. So it was very, very helpful. But then as I was a minister in New York, I was partying all the time and preaching and just living in a lot of dissonance. So I quit my job and basically lost everything all at once and ended up moving to California to get some distance from my religious community and to restart. And then just have invested thousands of hours and dollars in my own personal healing and therapy, with working with different modalities, like I mentioned, meditation, psychedelics, and just all kinds of the smorgasbord of things to where I'm at now. And it's been quite the process.
Well, could I ask, going back a few steps, as you're going through this deconversion, was the majority of the issues, were they more philosophical, as in this God sounds psychopathic, or this story in the Bible sounds really bizarre? Was there more to it? And what I'm getting to is, were you looking at aspects such as the origins of Judaism or Christianity, or the origins of the Bible? Were you looking at other aspects, or was it primarily like a both a psychological analysis of yourself and your own journey, and mixed with just the what you're sensing philosophically about this God character? Like how many cracks, how many venues of cracks did you really have to kind of explore for this to really keep moving forward in a deconstruction sense?
Yeah, it really started out with the psychology and the mental health for me, but that coincided with the intellectual issues. Like that more set off the intellectual issues. And so everyone's different. For a lot of people, it starts intellectual. But I mean, really, there are both going on. They're kind of hard to separate. But so during my deconversion process, I was doing all the intellectual skepticism, rationality, Richard Dawkins, all of those things.
When you went down that path, what were some of the high points that you recall of what you felt kind of obligated to investigate to be able to put certain topics to bed? Like, for example, for me, I began after it was more the psychology of, or the philosophy of what this God character was like. The genocide of Canaan, the slavery, taking child brides after you've slaughtered all the people, all that horrible stuff that just is like, this sounds more man-made and tribalistic than a God. But it quickly evolved. I mean, quickly within a few months, evolved to a study of if this is sounding so weird, then I need to know, is it weird because I'm just saying it's weird, or is it weird because there's actually a problem here? And meaning it led me to say, where did this come from? Like, what actually is this that I thought I studied it all. I thought I knew it all. What is it? And so it began to lead down the questions of like, who is Yahweh? And what was that? Where did that character come into history? What else do we know about the Yahweh character apart from what the Bible says? How did they create the canon? Was Jesus unique? Were there other people that were like him? Because you get the message a lot in church. Oh, Jesus is unique among all the other gods. Was it possible that he was copied at all? Was there any mythology involved in that? And of course, you can do very couple simple Google searches, and that just expands exponentially, as you know. But those stories of the origins of it all was what really, because like to me, the whole idea of Jesus as king, God as king, if something felt weird to me, like, I don't like this whole genocide of Canaan thing, even if you explain it away, like, oh, it was only a few hundred people, it wasn't thousands or whatever, and they weren't child brides, whatever, find some way to explain it away, granted, but a lot of Christians do find some way to justify it, which is pretty weird to me. But whether you do that or you just take it at face value the way it's written, if God is king and God is real, then ultimately you still have to bow your knee to that. Because if he says, I think this is the best way for my people to live their lives, if he's real and he's king, he's in charge, and he's the judge to whom we all must give account, you can't ultimately question that if it's real. So the big question in my mind was, is this actually real? And that's where it unravels for me. And I guess I'm asking if there's any levels like that you felt like you really needed to investigate certain subjects with that to begin to process how real this really was.
Yeah, I think that it really started unraveling quickly for me, and it was helpful too that Princeton Seminary was not fundamentalist in their framework. So there were a lot of people there who didn't believe in inerrancy and who they studied higher criticism and deconstructed the Bible. But the liberal Christianity didn't really work for me. I was like, no, this doesn't quite cut it. You're still buying into it. So I mean, I did my own research and studying from there, but I still was clinging on to the identity and the vocational identity for quite some time until I was just like, I woke up one day and I realized I'm just not a Christian anymore.
What was that like? How long did that take to go from I'm really, really, really not feeling like things are right to I'm out? Was that a day, a week, a month?
I think it was about 2 years.
Okay.
Something around 2 years.
Gotcha. When you finally kind of verbalized it to yourself, I'm done with Christianity, this, whatever, how did you say it to yourself, or how would you remember saying it? And what was that like? Did it shock you? Were you concerned about like things like, wow, does this mean there's no afterlife? Does this mean I don't see my loved ones who've already passed? Like, what were the ramifications that came into your head, and did they shake you up at all, or were you okay with that?
It definitely shook me up. It was extremely traumatic. And I think leaving one's religion is one of the more traumatic and jarring life events people can go through, on the scale of maybe even losing a partner or a major life event. And I think one of the problems I see is people tend not to give themselves the leeway or the attention they deserve in actually addressing the religious trauma as a major life event. They tend to think I can just research this on my own, read some books, join some groups. And it's your whole identity. It's every single area of your life is dictated by the authority of the deity and the religious institution. So for me, it just all came crashing down like a house of cards. So when I had that moment, that epiphany that I'm not a Christian and I'm not afraid, it was very liberating. It was very peaceful in that moment. But then I had all the fallout of having a crushed self-esteem, low self-worth, self-hatred, sexual repression, fear, anxiety, lost my sense of meaning, grieving the death of God, anger and rage. I mean, we could go through the whole gamut of issues.
With some of the more negative parts of that list you just gave, was there any sense of freedom, like maybe focus, just to pick one, the sexual shame, just to say, oh, no one's been in my head all this time. No one's been judging me. I'm not bad because there's no judge to define that. I get to define it myself. Was there a freedom involved, or was it all kind of negative at first?
It was a ton of freedom. It was a huge weight off of me. I mean, almost like a salvation moment.
Yeah.
Coming to Jesus through leaving Jesus.
It's amazing you say that, because there's so many verses like that come to mind that are like that exact thing, like
yeah,
like the truth shall set you free. Like, yes, the truth did set me free from the Bible.
It was my exorcism of Jesus.
Yes.
Sort of. I mean, at least one version of Jesus anyway. So
awesome.
So much freedom. Just having that mental space, not having a God police me, not having all this authority, this conformity, not having to go to church was great. Having my Sundays free,
yeah.
but little things like that. But the bigger things, being able to embrace my sexuality, being able to just embrace my basic humanity and explore and learn, and intellectual freedom. I mean, I think when people leave, they tend to become learning sponges and just go on this intellectual binge, because we had been so isolated for so long from the rest of the world. Right now, there's so much to catch up on.
Yeah. And I want to go on in a second to the next step of your process, but I do just want to highlight one thing you said a minute ago. The idea of it being like a traumatic loss, a death. What a great thing to emphasize, because for a lot of people, they really don't give themselves that freedom to just stop and process what happened. And part of it is, honestly, in my experience, and this is just me speaking to it, but it's because of what happens from other Christians. Other Christians are going to, if they're aware of what's going on, if you're verbal at all, which I was, they're going to pretty much start saying, what are you doing? It's almost like you're trying to advocate for something bad, as if you're coming up and saying, hey, everybody, we should all start getting into some really bad habit. And it's like, of course not. We're going to reject what you're doing. You can bring a bad message. And of course, if there's other people involved, they're suddenly going to get tempted to disbelieve the Bible. You're suddenly kind of like this bad, this prophet for Satan, so to speak, or you're bringing such a bad influence on people. So there's like a semi sense of like, should we shun this person? Should we ostracize them? And the other side is the reach out of like, hey, we need to reach you. You need to repent. You just believe the gospel. Let's shove it back down your throat. And here you are as the basically a victim of a horrible system, with people all around you that are still in it. You've thankfully had the luck of the draw to have enough experiences that brought you to a point that shook you up and said, this is not real. This has never been real. And there's this glorious sense of, I got out. And most people don't. What a great thing. But it is a death. You're dying to your old self, so to speak, to borrow a biblical term. You're dying to your old self, this self that was made in the image of following Christ, and Christ in you with the Spirit. You're dying to this God character having never existed. He's not even dying. You're dying to you're realizing you were deluded. This whole love life, Jesus, your prayer life, I was talking to the walls this whole time. And it's such a death. It really is a death.
Mhm.
And yet people try to undercut it, and they do it passively. I mean, I don't want to attack people because I know that they're not mentally able to process it, but it is so insensitive. I mean, just to wrap this part up, it's so insensitive to people. When people are deconverting for the right reasons, they're not just saying, "Oh, the pastor was a jerk, I'm leaving my church. I don't like the pastor," or whatever. I mean, you actually really deconvert. You investigate the origins of Christianity, of Judaism, of the Bible. You realize this was never real. You deconvert, you deconstruct, you're out, and you're out permanently. I mean, you could not get pulled back in if you deconstruct the right way. Under any circumstances, you're done. And yet the grieving process has to happen properly for you to feel like you can be happy again. And all they can say, honestly, is stuff like, you're wrong, you need to be repentant, and if you dare to reach out to people of this new, this new belief or lack of belief system, I should say, this atheism or agnosticism, or just, I'm just not a Christian anymore, I'm not sure what I am. If you dare to reach out, they throw something in your face like, see, you just want a different kind of church. You still want church, you just want a different kind of church.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's so insensitive to people who are going through a true grieving process. And I just want to second what you're saying. Give yourself the time, give yourself the space to grieve this thing. The grief is real, and it's so intense. And I think it was more intense for other people than for me, but even for me, it was a lot. It's a lot of stuff to process quickly.
Very much so. So I think people should generally get professional help, therapy, or like this coaching thing, or just really intentionally take this thing on, and recognize whether you want to be in this or not, you're in it. You're in a healing phase of your life, and the process has to happen, or the trauma will continue to ripple through your life.
Yeah. And a lot of it too, just as one more side note of this, a lot of it's just redefining reality, understanding reality was not this whole list of things you thought it was, whether it's sexuality, shame, the ultimate reality of what's what the afterlife might be or not be, the sense of just who you are. It's like I go back to this illustration a lot, but just Neo in the Matrix, when they pull him out of, they unplug him and he's on their little, spaceship flying around, and they're trying to, heal his body, and he opens his eyes and the lights are bright, and he's like, why do my eyes hurt so much? And they're like, you've never used them before. And it's really like you don't just get to step away from the darkness of Christianity and of theism. You're actually kind of, you're opening your eyes for the first time. It's like you're a baby again. You're a baby to life, and it's a beautiful thing. It's weird at first, but you're a baby to life, and you're understanding reality for the first time, and it can be glorious if you go through it in a healthy way. And I've seen for myself, being able to think through even issues, especially of sexuality, especially of pleasure, that whole realm. If you just don't try to bring in, well, how can I merge my new belief with this? Just try to clear the table. That's been helpful to me, is just clear the table, and let's redefine reality without all the bad stuff. Anyway, could you take us back to your story? Where did you land after all that?
Yeah. So in California, and rebuilding my life, exploring my humanity, working deeply on my healing, and coming into the work that I'm doing now, started writing, blogging, speaking, and working with people, and then exploring my own version of spirituality.
Now this brings us to the non-dual humanist. Is that what would that be
right.
a good point to
That's
bring this
right.
in? Okay.
Sure.
So take us in. This if it's deep, take us as deep as we got to go to understand this. I want to understand what it looks like to be a non-dual humanist.
Okay. All right. So I very much resonate with humanism, and I mean a lot of atheism. And when I came out, I landed in this very much Richard Dawkins, Hitchens style of atheism. And I still resonate with a lot of that. But I was exposed first to what I'll just say mysticism through psychedelics. And I found them to be incredibly healing. I healed from fear of death, depression, a lot of anxiety. I mean, they've been one of the most healing things I've ever worked with. But they brought me in touch with a whole realm of experiences that I never had before. I mean, like the kind of visions that they talk about in the Bible, right? But that I had never experienced. I was promised all of these glorious visions and signs and wonders and things, but what I experience now blows that away. Without saying that it's supernatural, right? I mean, I think everything is natural. Everything's a part of nature, even if we don't quite understand how it works. So I ended up exploring this whole realm. Really got into meditation, firstly for anxiety, and it helped me so much with the anxiety.
Was your sleep starting to get better at that point?
Yeah, definitely. And exploring Buddhist philosophy, which I was really shocked that it's really essentially a philosophy and psychology of mind designed around how to deal with suffering and how to create more mental space and freedom so that you can have free action, because we're not just caught in our loops in our programming. We're able to create space. And even there's the Buddha might have been an atheist. It's really interesting. He discouraged prayer. He didn't believe in some kind of controlling deity. He believed in what could be considered supernatural beings, but I mean, then again, you could look at those as entities that exist on some kind of a different spectrum that's not like, what do we mean by supernatural, right? So regardless, I started to see that there is all this wisdom in these mystical traditions, including Hinduism, including yoga, which is more about psycho-spiritual practice and techniques than it is about that kind of external worshiping all these gods kind of a thing. That there's actually thousands of years of highly sophisticated philosophy and psychology in all over the world too. And a lot of it is lumped together with religion. And I think what I did when I left was I had this assumption that all religions were just like Christianity. Basically that I knew that Christianity was BS. So Hinduism and Buddhism and all this, it's all BS. And it's the same kind of thing. And I discovered it really isn't. It really isn't. I mean, it's so different. And there's so much more vast, in my opinion, because it's more pluralistic and not exclusivistic. So, and there are elements that are religious and dogmatic, but there are also elements that are really just philosophy that we don't have in the West. That it's just a whole other territory, and also psychology that we don't have in the West. So there's a great enterprise now that's happening with modern psychology is incorporating Eastern psychology. So the whole mindfulness movement, that's Buddhism. That's what it is.
Could I ask I don't want to sidetrack what you're saying, but just could I ask when you mentioned psychedelics, could you define that a little bit more? And are we talking about something that was helpful in the sense of freeing you up, or was it actually like what you felt and experienced like as visions that felt like a new version of spirituality? Like, could you just, because that is a different realm that I have never explored or even considered exploring, to be honest. And I'm not sure I would explore it, even knowing about it more. But I'd love to just understand more. What was that? What are the details of using psychedelics for that healing process?
So this is a whole other area that I give talks on and have written a lot about. But it is, I just started using them. I was exposed to them initially at Burning Man, and I found them to be so illuminating and healing on they're referred to as medicines, and they've been used in traditional shamanic settings for thousands of years for healing. Because that's what they tend to do, is to connect people to the deepest parts of themselves and also a sense of connection with the natural world. So really in the 60s, a lot of the social justice and environmental movements were very connected and often came out of the psychedelic movement that was happening. And now there's a psychedelic renaissance. There's an explosion of scientific research. They're being decriminalized. Mushrooms, psilocybin, are in breakthrough status for treating major depression with the FDA. They're scheduled for that right now, MDMA for PTSD. So there's a lot of work going on here. They're very, very healing and powerful. It's kind of like sitting with this medicine is like sitting with a therapist. It really tends to feel like almost like there's another entity or something guiding this journey. It could just be your own psyche, right? But there's this interaction that's happening, and I think that there's real interaction happening with the natural world. That there's this sixth sense might not be the right word, but it's just this whole other realm of human experience that tends to be grouped as spiritual or mystical or intuitive. But I was really shocked at these things. Like, I never wanted to touch spirituality. I was super triggered by anyone who talks about crystals or New Age or anything. I hated it. I was set off by it. And I'm not saying that that's all true, right? But that I was really shocked to discover that there were these realms of consciousness and human experience that I had never been exposed to in religion, and that were never talked about by the atheists who I had been exposed to. And so what I found is that people who do this kind of work, and it's not just with psychedelics, you can access these non-ordinary states of consciousness, shifting brain states and other things, just through using the breath, through methods of breath work, something called holotropic breath work, through yoga, through other contemplative practices that tend to really give you easy access to your traumas, to whatever kind of existential questions you're dealing with, and also often bring inspiration. People have discovered inventions or gone into these creative states through
really
these
cool.
experiences. So it's very powerful.
So just make sure I don't skip the chance. What does it mean to be a non-dual humanist? Like, what is the actual definition of that?
So non-dualism, it means not two. And it's a philosophy that all of reality is an undivided whole, that there's no separation between subjectivity or objectivity, between consciousness or the material world, that mind and matter are essentially the same thing at different levels, or you could say different dimensions.
Is that like in contrast to the Greek dualism, like of body is bad, spirit's good kind of thing?
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's saying it's all the same. It's all non-separate. And that this is not only a philosophy, it's an experiential observation. So that, again, through these practices that I mentioned, or these things happen spontaneously to a lot of people, that it can be experienced, this deep connection to nature, or people will describe it as an expansion of consciousness, where you feel a state of oneness, a timelessness, connection with the whole universe, all of reality. And it's also based on the idea that reality is actually united, and almost take like an organismic view, almost like a Gaia view of the universe, that everything really is connected in nature. I mean, and even look at it like, so you have the cells in your body, right? And the cells don't know that they're a part of the liver, and the liver doesn't know it's a part of the body. And we don't tend to think that we're part of an ecosystem, solar system, planet, universe. Any kind of a shift in an atomic level affects things pretty much everywhere. Like, it's this web of interconnectivity. And what, through these kinds of mystical experiences, there's actually a way of experiencing that. It's not just an intellectual thing. It's on the consciousness level. And so non-dualism is based on that, the idea of oneness, of non-division and non-separation. And so from that, it's like when you have this experience of being, say, connected to a tree, like on a conscious level, and having some kind of interaction with it that you wouldn't normally have just in your regular awareness, then it becomes a part of myself, and I start to experience other people as a part of myself, and like also that my humanity is beyond my ego, even my conception of myself. And so it's harder to harm other people and easier to love other people when we grasp at an experiential, intuitive level that level of connection. And to me, that's also humanism is like that, right?
Yeah.
Humanism values nature and the greater humanity and our role in that, and putting that as central, like not this kind of a hierarchical view and elitist view of the religion.
Since we talked about sexuality a few times, I'll bring that into this topic. Do you find that people who kind of understand and really understand the implications of the non-dual humanist perspective, that it helps at least a little bit with trying to heal some of the trauma of just the whole weird dichotomy of like God made you human, so he clearly made your sexuality, but you're pretty much anything you use it for, most of it's going to be something God would condemn, and you're bad for it. So technically it's good, but in reality, it's in practice, it's your thought life and a lot of the things you do or would do, if you could, if society lets you do it, it's all bad, 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 bad. Just that whole split. Do you find that if you're, or even just the general split of mind versus body, your mind's good, your spirit's good, your body's bad, do you find that as people start to embrace a non-dual humanist perspective, that some of that begins to heal? I mean, I'm making an implication, I guess, that they would say, if you start with sexuality is not a bad thing, it's normal or good,
Mhm.
however you describe it, that if we're all, if it's not like a, well, my spirit wants to be holy, I want to be this person in a white robe that doesn't even care about sexuality and just want to sing songs to Jesus all day, but my body wants to be so passionate, erotic, and pleasuring, just that whole separation of my passions, that maybe if you're seeing yourself, I'm making some jumps right now, but just for the sake of my oversimplifying it, bear with me, just that, is it possible that when you put those together, in that sense, that people begin to kind of let the good side of it, or at least to the removal of the bad side of it, to let
Big
that kind of
time.
override things?
Big time. So
Hmm.
in tantric yoga, this is a whole system that part of it is working with sexuality for mystical experiences, because sexual intercourse and different, just sexuality, can also be a way of experiencing these kinds of states, because it's connection at a deep level. And the thing about non-dualism too is, I would say, the work is integration. It's about integration, bringing things together. So understanding that what we maybe had considered spiritual is not separate from your sexuality. It's the same. It's all connected, right? So your humanity, your body, and it's all integrated. You can't cut out any one part of it without severing a part of existence and cutting yourself off from it. So everything is a means of, can be used as a means of healing or deeper experiencing. And the
Cool.
non-dual really is about integration, because with the whole understanding of non-dual, uh, our typical experience is one of dualities: me and not me, light and dark, good and bad, this dualism, and me separate from other people. But in a non-dual realm, you start to experience that unity, or something, you could even use the word transcendent, but also immanent. So like, you can't have light without darkness, and they're actually on the same spectrum. Or you can't have good without evil. They're actually, it's like the snake eating its tail kind of an understanding, which is Taoism is basically close to a non-dual agnostic or atheistic philosophy too.
Hmm.
So
It honestly reminds me of some of the ways they wove that religious sense into the Star Wars Force concept as well, like a balance between it all. I mean,
yeah,
not to commercial put it into some kind of commercial sense, but I know that it's not that Star Wars came up with a religion; they were just borrowing some of these concepts to create their version of it. But it's the sense of the balance between it all.
definitely. I mean, and even another example, like, so the state of samadhi or
Mm.
nirvana that's described in Eastern religions is a reproducible experience of feeling like completely connected with the universe in a timeless, completely expansive place of pure love and light, that people describe as the same kind of a near death or after death experience, people who've died and been brought back. So things like that, that could just be all in your brain. Um, but it also kind of corresponds to the philosophy of union and of the state of oneness corresponding to a deeper love and empathy for other people. And having that experience changes people. When you have that kind of a profound top type experience, it really tends to result in a lot of psychological change. And there's a lot of evidence and studies that are happening with this. So this is something I'm fascinated with. But yeah.
So could I ask, just to finish up the meditation part of it, or the non-dual humanist, what do you do on a practical basis in your life, when you're not talking about your counseling work or your your studies, but just when it's just you in the quietness of your own house, the quietness of you with your own thoughts? What do you do currently to stay as healthy as you can personally, or to heal?
Quite a number of things. I'm a self-help junkie, for sure. I mean, so I'm in my own therapy. I have my own meditation practice. I've been on a Vipassana retreat, which is a 10-day silent meditation retreat. So powerful, probably the most powerful thing I've ever done. So really getting to observe the patterns of my mind, and also coming to these different states of consciousness, like deeper kind of peace. There are also non-dual meditations. So I've been exploring different conferences and events that use different kinds of meditations that really, actually, a lot of them are about body awareness, increasing your body awareness and increasing that connection, exploring my dreams, and really integrating my emotions has been a big part of my healing. Really getting out of that dualistic perspective, like good and bad emotions. Anger is bad, envy is bad, jealousy is bad, and learning that all of it is a part of life, all of it has a role, and learning to integrate that and to elevate and to grow in love. And part of where I'm at now has been an integration place, because I don't really feel anger about the fundamentalism so much anymore. It doesn't really trigger me anymore. So I think because I've done a lot of the grief work.
Yeah.
So at this point, like I can appreciate some things in the Bible, and I like to now. I'm kind of, my edge is to be able to relate more to fundamentalists, and like even to talk with them and appreciate those things, and almost get on that level without being in it. If that makes sense.
It does, and I was gonna say, I admire you for saying that and doing that, because that's one of the hardest challenges, I think, for people who are deconverting, especially recently, is that you just want to scream sometimes, like, what you're in is so untrue and so unhealthy, and you feel like you're walking away. But the fact that you're willing to build those bridges as much as you can, in the healthiest ways you can, that's obviously the most commendable path, is keep the bridges open if we can, build the relationships if we can. So I appreciate you bringing that part of it back into the discussion, because a lot of us struggle with that a lot.
And it's a big part of the process of healing religious trauma. One of the biggest is, how do you relate to your community? How do you set your boundaries?
Yes.
So, I mean, some of that might be necessary. Sometimes we do actually need to distance from people, or not relate to them at all, or for periods of time, and learn what works for us, what we need.
Could I ask, speaking, since we're talking about other people who are religious, I feel bad for having gone down a path of talking about healthiness and good things so much, to go back into maybe a more negative side of it. But how did people respond to you at first, especially the people that were closest to you, loved ones, and how do people respond to you now that you've been out for a while? Is in the sense of, is there any sense of respect maybe that people have given you for that you're bringing some things to the table? Or are a lot of people just like, what, you're talking about psychedelics and Buddhism, what in the world, come back to Jesus? Like, how do people respond to that? I'm sure there's a whole range of, so summarize it however you want to. But
there is, I mean, when I first came out, and it is a coming out process, usually a process for people of actually telling their communities, So that's a whole issue of recovery. But when I first came out, my community, they were kind to me. And I mean, they're kind, empathic people, and they do care about me and love me. But I think part of it too is that they have to be nice within that framework to be a good witness. That's part of the reconversion, right? So they would make comments and say, we're praying for you, and like, do you want to talk to us, and try to be a witness. And they would. There were people who tried to evangelize me. It was just so funny because I'm like, I know exactly what you're doing. You know, I've done this, I've studied it. It's just not, but they would try to do that. And I mean, I did isolate from them. And so, and then I started really swinging too. After a couple years, when I felt more comfortable, I started writing and posting online. And that at first I was really in an angry stage too. So I was pretty aggressive and combative a lot of times, which, you know, was part of the process. Maybe not ideal, but whatever. I mean, we were abused and hurt too. So they can take it a little bit, maybe. Maybe it'll wake some people up, ruffle some feathers. But so people were, you know, really concerned, really engaging in some of the conversionism. But what was really cool for me too is that my story and my coming out about it has really, I think, empowered and encouraged other people to do the same. So I found that a lot of people from Wheaton College also left Christianity. So it was really interesting. The people in my past who I never would have expected, who had also left, or who were also in their process. And there are quite a number of them in all of the churches I've been a part of. So you really never know where people are at, or, you know, what they're going through. I mean, people are suffering. People who are in these religions are suffering, and sometimes they're not aware of it. But I think a lot of people now are really uncomfortable with LGBTQIA plus issues. I think that's a big one, and the politics. I think a lot of people are being shaken in these religions because, especially those two issues, and those were always cracks in the system for me too. And looking back, I think looking back in my life, I can see things that were always cracks, never really sat right with me. But yeah, so people have responded. Mostly, I get positive responses from the people who are actually engaging my work. And every so often there's some kind of reconversion attempt, but I find it amusing. It's kind of fun at this point.
Are your parents still living?
They are, yeah, and they're still ministering. My father's still a minister.
Did they ever try to talk to you about this, or have they kind of said their piece at this point?
They've set their piece at this point. I mean, they've said that they'll say that we're praying for you and things like that, but we really don't talk about this issue, which I think is healthy, being able to relate on just a human to human issue, a human to human place. And again, me coming to a place now where recognizing that everyone's where they're at on their journey. I mean, including people who are like serial killers or whatever. I mean, I'm not superior to anyone. I might have knowledge that I think is more freeing. I might have a little less delusion, a little less ignorance, but I've still got a long way to go too.
Yeah, I thought a lot too. It must be so weird, and I say this because I was in it, but it's so weird to like try to do normalish life with someone, knowing that in your mind you think they're at any point gonna, when they die, they're gonna burn in eternal torment. Like, how do you say even have a nice day? Like, it doesn't really matter if you have a nice day. Like, if time is like this little blip and eternity is forever and you're going to be in, you know, screaming agony, have a nice day is irrelevant. And it's kind of, it's amazing to me how many Christians, even myself, how we can kind of believe that, you know, have believed that before, and yet not just dropped everything we could, you know, just to constantly share the gospel if there's that much at stake, and if you really believe it, which I think a lot of us didn't really believe it in some level, like a cognitive dissonance. Like, I believe it, but I don't. Kind of like when you know, if Christians have someone who dies prematurely in life, and everyone's like, well, that person was a believer, they're going to be in heaven, So it's technically a wonderful thing. They're now free of whatever their, sickness or whatever. They're never going to hurt again. They're with Jesus. It's the most blessed thing you could have happen to you. And yet for everyone that's still here on the earth, it's like this horrible tragedy. Like, it just never ends. Like, people just keep bringing it up. This horrible thing that this person died early, and woe is us. And it's like a yearly, with Facebook brings things up from every year, and it's like, oh, a year ago this horrible thing happened. And it's like, wait a second, if you're really believing this, then this wasn't horrible at all. There's a brief snippet of like oh, I lost them, and then forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, you're with them again, and everything's great. But you don't really believe that, do you? That's why it's so tragic to you. That's why it hurts so much. And I find that an interesting psychological side note of like, did we actually believe this? Were we really okay going to McDonald's and ordering a hamburger, knowing that everyone behind the counter that's working there and everyone in the restaurant might be on their way to hell? And we don't say anything to them, just order a hamburger and go on our way. It's like, it's an interesting side topic for another day, but I do think about that a lot myself. I was just curious to, with your work, kind of bringing up full cycle to your work, with your website, lifeafterdogma.org. A lot of questions I could ask you, but do you find that when people are looking back at this, and they're saying, hopefully some of them saying for the first time, my trauma, my issues were at least in part directly based on this religious stuff, that this was not coincidence. I wasn't feeling anxious in my heart and having my heart raced or sleep issues, blah, 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 because of some other issue, and religion just made it worse. But that it actually was either in large part or in whole the origin of the issue. And do you find people willing to really think through that? Or do you feel like a lot of people are like, that's just too hard? I guess what I mean is that there's a lot of people that it seems like the actual admission of saying, my parents are wrong, my pastor was wrong, my grandparents, great grandparents, they're all wrong, they were all wrong. That's it. Number one, it sounds arrogant. Like, I'm sort of technically judging everyone. They're so wrong. You're also condemning yourself, so to speak. Like, if for me it took me 43 years to get out, you're kind of saying I kind of wasted, in a sense, 43 years. So I was very wrong. Like, how hard is it for people to just stand up and say, this whole thing, it just needs to go? And I guess maybe as a corollary to just asking your opinion on this, if you had a choice of getting rid of religion, now this is obviously theoretical, but if you had a button you could push and say, I'm just going to get rid of religion, not spirituality, not healthy psychological work, but just pure religion, the whole, I want to worship a god, I want to believe in blood magic, I want to have a death cult focused on human sacrifice and scapegoating. Do you feel like it, like, would you try to get rid of it if you could? Or do you feel like there is, like, do you see some people that are almost happier, where it's like, if they actually went through the door that says, I am done with religion, that they would actually, because they were so enmeshed in it, that for them, even though it's not technically true, and you know it, I know it, and maybe they know it on some level, but for them, they're so enmeshed in it that it would actually create an unhealthiness. Like, I see people that I think, I would love to help you understand where this came from, and I'd love to see you escape. But there's some people that seem so wound up in it, especially when they're older, and especially if they're like, hey, I'm about to go see Jesus. I only got a year left, or 5 years left, and chances are better than not that I'm about to go see Jesus and start my real life in heaven. To tell them, no, you're not. You're about to die and turn back into dust. It's almost like this wouldn't help them. I don't know. I don't know if you understand my question, but I guess, do you find people where religion is just, it's actually they're healthier staying in it?
Totally. And I think there were two questions. I think the first one was about acceptance, something like that. And that is a big thing. That's a process too, I think, accepting what happened, grieving the loss of years, and also integrating that whole thing and not seeing it entirely as a loss. So that's a whole process. But As far as this, yeah, what is the role of religion now? Again, my views on this have evolved a little bit, and I think a lot of it was my perspective was very tainted by my anger and my trauma. So now at this point, I identify the problem with these religions with dogma,
Mm.
which is dogma is it means this is the way that it is because I said so, and you cannot question it. And dogma runs throughout all kinds of philosophies and approaches to life. So it's based on authority, not evidence, and faith and assent, and it's submission. It's actually a fascism.
Yeah.
It's an outside, some kind of authority that you must submit to, and there's a consequence for not submitting to it. And that's the basis of the biblical inerrancy, biblical fascism, biblical authoritarianism. So if you have some kind of an open approach, then I think then the harm isn't there as much. And really this really religious freedom, really spiritual freedom, pluralism. I mean, postmodernism or the postmodern critique of modernity, that there really is a plurality and that there is an irreducible element of mystery here. So I would say the dogma is one thing that I would get rid of, if you will, but it's a tendency within humans. There's a psychology to dogma, right? So it's always something that's going to be there. That's the antichrist, if you will. That's the thing that persecutes spirit or spirituality, which is, I see, as sovereignty, sovereign empowerment of the human being, of your psyche. So that's the thing. The oppressive systems, and for a lot of these religions, the dogma is so tied up in it. I mean, that they would essentially cease to exist without it. But I do think that it's possible for them to basically evolve into more or less progressive cultural traditions where they have these shared rituals and stories, and it's not dogmatic. So in that sense, I'm okay with that kind of a thing. But when there's also a recognition of evidence, of science, of the errors, and like that these are really stories and morals and traditions that we share. And so we do see that with like versions of Judaism and Islam too, and Christianity, where there are people who really will recognize all of this and even consider themselves atheists, but still identify with those traditions. And even atheism is a big spectrum. There are Hindu atheists, people don't realize, Hindu atheists, who but tend to have a different philosophy than philosophical materialism, usually, often, not entirely. So there's this big spectrum out there. But for me, religion, if it meant something that I would be okay with, would be basically community that has some kind of rituals or practices that elevate and encourage each other in their sovereignty and in the good of humanity.
A great way to put it. I like that a lot. I do want to kind of bring us to our conclusion by asking for people that maybe have gone through this, some of this stuff, maybe it's resonating with them, and it's kind of, maybe they're more in the starting point where they haven't really investigated all these areas. They haven't certainly done much healing, but they maybe recognize the need to. Maybe they're still in religion, maybe they're not, but they're at least stepping away from some of the dogma that you talked about. Obviously, people that are right there near you could, reach out to you and people that you work with. But for people that that aren't right there near you, or for people that could maybe connect with you online and people like you, what kind of resources do you recommend people start with, especially if they're just brand new, where they're like a lot of the groups I'm with, talk to on Facebook and other places, it's like there's a newness to it. It's like I'm just starting, people, they're asking people in the group, like, what is it like for you all to deal with this issue and that issue? Because it feels so new to me. And I feel like it kind of brings it back up to, you're like, you remember how fresh it was, because you can, after a while you forget some of the initial emotions, but it's like, oh, wow, yeah, that's an important issue, that needs to be, brought to the table. And for people that are kind of maybe admitting that this isn't just a question of, for example, the intellectual side that I touched on before, like, maybe people, they really do need to dive into where did the origins of the Bible come from, and Christianity and Judaism. What was canonicity? What's early church history about? Were there, they need to know that there weren't 4 gospels, there were 40 plus gospels, that wasn't a book of Acts, there were 6 books of Acts. They need to know that there were forgeries and counter forgeries, and some of the forgeries are still in your Bible, and that there's a lot of different Bibles, even today. They need to know that information. They need to know a bunch of stuff like that. And we could go on and on about those kind of things. But for most people, they cross like a threshold, and they kind of say, I want to keep studying this. Like myself, I study it every day, but I don't need more information to know this was wrong. And I now need to start to rethink, recreate, how do I live then? To borrow Francis Schaeffer's, how do I then live knowing that Francis Schaeffer was wrong? How do you, for someone that's, say within the first year of that, or maybe they don't even know that they've deconverted, but they have, and they're, starting to admit to themselves that it's already happened, they just couldn't verbalize it. What's some of the best practices for getting started, in your opinion, especially for people that are more like loners, where they, families all Christian, all their friends were Christian, they don't have people to go hang out with. They can support them and talk through this and say, yeah, I know you have good questions, those are good issues. Everyone's just going to say you're dead wrong. For those people that are loners, that are on the starting process, and they're honestly kind of lost, could you just kind of maybe wrap us up with some good starting points for those people to think about?
Yeah, I would say that you deserve the best help you can find. So really treat yourself like royalty here in terms of your healing, and really value yourself. And this is self-worth, which people might have trouble with because of the religious programming, is really that self-love and self-valuation, is that you are fully deserving of the best care and the best self-care, the best professional care. So I really think people should be in some kind of therapy, or working with some kind of expert, someone like me or Marlene or someone like that, whoever you connect with, right?
Would
Whatever
you advise
works.
more of a secular therapist in these?
If that's what you identify with, whatever feels like a fit for you. And I always point people to themselves. Really, it's really simple in some ways. Almost too easy, is really tuning into your body, into your heart, into your center. What feels right for me? And you can start to identify, even questioning a belief or something. I feel guilty, like God is going to judge me for being sexual. Tune into that voice. How does that feel? Does that feel like it's coming from your center? Does it feel authentic to you? Or does it feel like shamey, fearful, some outside voice? And I think that practice of really learning to come into yourself, inhabit your body, inhabit your own desires, trust your intuition, regaining that sense of self, even though you're going to make mistakes, but really trusting that you can trust yourself, and starting to exercise that. So that looks like, if I want to start reading on these topics, go explore it. If I want to start trying these practices that for my health, like join a yoga studio, do martial arts, do the meditation, whatever, anything at all, then start really following your own lead. And I would say joining some kind of support group, like my Facebook group, or like other groups that exist, is great to have, to connect with other people. There might not be people in your area, but with the internet, you can find these things.
Yeah, I love how you phrase that, and just the whole idea of people claiming their identity. And I forget how you put it exactly in the one sentence you said, but we're kind of trained as from young children to believe that, trust in the Lord with all your heart and don't lean on your own understanding, and to begin to start to step back from that and say, no, you are able to trust yourself, trust your instincts, trust what's in your best interest, admit, who you are, reclaim who you are, and to be able to step away from this whole concept of, you're a sinner, and it pretty much you are so warped by sin and by your own Adamic nature that you cannot think correctly about the world, and to start to reframe that in so many ways that, we've touched on some, and there's a lot more, but to reframe that and to re-embrace, just to be able to start yourself again. I mean, you're going to hit the reset button. And it's like, for myself, I struggle with some time lost, but it's like, whether you're 20 years old or 40 or 60, hit the reset button where you are, and start to unlearn, to borrow a Star Wars Yoda word, unlearn what you've learned, start, clear the table, and then get some really healthy things back on that table. And what a great process. And I love that what you're doing. I'm more involved in my work with not work, but my passions with the whole intellectual side. What I'm studying, for example, how the book of Enoch is quoted, dozens and dozens of times in the New Testament. No one ever told me that.
Mm-hmm.
The intellectual side is fascinating, but this whole side of it that you deal with, I think it's just, there's a part of me that pulls my heart. It's like, it's not, this is not, it's, for a lot of people it is primarily intellectual, but when you get past that and you say, okay, my intellectual side has been satisfied, I recognize this is not reality. Jesus is not the Son of God. He's not God. Yahweh is not real. Once you cross the intellectual threshold, you realize you've only just begun. Just because you got out, because you got some facts, your journey isn't over. It's just beginning. And I appreciate that you help people
Yeah.
to take that journey, and you help people to get there.
And I'm really a big nerd too. I mean, I'm very, very into the intellectual, probably to an imbalanced amount. But another thing here is that I think Christianity is a very heady religion. It's very much about ideas. And so it is very intellectual in one respect, even though it's fallacious. It very much trains people to be in their minds and in their egoic selves. So I find a lot of the work, I love the word integration, is developing all aspects of the self, the body, the mind, psyche, the emotions, the whatever, transpersonal, mystical, whatever you call that. And all of them increase all the other aspects. So when I'm optimizing my body and my emotions, my intellect goes up too, all of it, total human.
Yeah. Very, very holistic. Could I ask an ending question? We've talked a lot about what your journey was like and what you're doing now. Could you give us a kind of a glimpse into what haven't you touched on in life yet, especially as it relates to any of this, but like what projects and what goals are kind of on the back burner that, or even just what subjects for a book or research, whatever, what haven't you been able to dive into yet that might come down the line in the next few years for kind of what's been burning on your heart?
So I do need to write a book on the religious trauma. I have a ton of blog articles. I read a lot of blog articles, but I need to integrate that into a book. I also have a lot of writing for a skeleton for a book dissecting Christianity. It's called New Age Christianity. So that's and going into a lot of the dogmatism and the history of that and the opposition to mysticism that's been pretty prominent. And so that's one thing. But I'm also planning on getting a PhD in Eastern philosophy. So really exploring more of the mysticism and the non-dualism and the philosophy, the intellectual side of it too, and connecting with nature, that connection that I'm talking about. So these experiential elements really call to me a lot.
Do you some of the things that you've done, and the you mentioned like the retreats that were very beneficial to you, do you think you would ever, like post COVID and so forth, do you think you would ever consider hosting retreats to mountain locations or somewhere in nature where people would kind of be able to really focus on this?
Definitely, 100%. Definitely different kinds of retreats. I would definitely be interested in that, in bringing in some of the meditation and somatic exercises, and probably psychedelic medicine retreats too.
Hmm.
There's ways to do that legally, more or less. I mean, within our current system. So definitely, I'm going to be doing a lot more.
That's awesome. Well, I would be interested. I'll be definitely keeping an eye on your website and your group, just because that some of the stuff sounds fascinating to me. I'd love to dive into some of it more and kind of follow the different venues that you explore and share with people. But I just want to say thank you for doing the interview, and thank you for your story. I know we went over your story pretty quickly compared to maybe what you could have done. I'm sure you could have expanded it to a couple hours if you told us all the details. But I know that behind a lot of people's stories, there's just a lot of hard stuff. There's a lot of pain, and I appreciate that you're willing to to share those stories. And I'm so thankful that you have been able to take we all see people that they go through a bad situation and they just turn it into screw you all, I'm done, and they walk away. And you've kind of taken a bad situation and some hard starts, and you've turned it into something beautiful and healthy. And you've also turned it out to other people. You wouldn't just say, I want to be healthy for myself, and this is all about me. You've turned it into a selflessness too. You're helping other people, and I appreciate what you're doing, and hope your voice gets stronger and stronger in all this.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you.